All right, so that's the title of my talk. For consistency, dialectism, and contradictory theology. And there's a subtitle, resolving or trying to resolve a theological problem in this specific tradition, which is the same tradition that Alan spoke about. Tintia Beda Peda Vedanta. My topic is a quite controversial one, right? Contradictory theology. So we all know that many religious traditions, they contain like contradictory descriptions of God. But see, what to do when I find out that my theology is contradictory? The standard move is simply to try to explain away the contradiction and try to show that the concept of God at hand is consistent. However, another option, which has recently attracted attention of many logicians and analytic philosophers of religion, is to reject such a move as unnecessary and defend what I call the contradictory God thesis. In its strongest version, the contradictory God thesis, is simply the thesis that God is a contradictory entity. In its weakest version, it says that a given contradictory concept of God is philosophically tenable. And of course, this option is strongly related to the advancement of paraconsistent logic and dialectism. And in their turn, these two things are related to two famous logical principles, which is the law of non-contradiction and the principle of exclusion. We know what the law of non-contradiction is about. This is a semantic and model version of the law of non-contradiction that says that there cannot be true contradictions. There are other versions as well, an ontological version that says that there are no contradictory entities. Anyway, I'm going to stick to this version. And the principle of exclusion says that anything follows from a contradiction. It's like an explosion in the sense that, in classical logic, we have that. If you have a contradiction, you have a kind of explosion of inferences. You can conclude anything. So there's an explosion like A, B, C, everything goes up, and the theory explodes. So dialectism can be seen as the claim that there are, or there might be, true contradictions or dialectics, thus challenging the law of non-contradiction. A paraconsistent logic is a logic that doesn't satisfy the principle of exclusion. Okay? Although these two, some people seem to conflate those two theses. They are quite different. Okay? And for instance, dialectism is a thesis about truth, and paraconsistency deals with the inferential aspect of our language. And dialectism does require paraconsistency, but paraconsistency neither requires nor entails dialectism. In fact, many paraconsistent logicians, they are against dialectism. This is important to notice. And okay, and so when we take this contradictory God thesis along with paraconsistency and dialectism, we get what I call paraconsistent theism and dialectic theism. There has been several kinds of applications, as I may call them, both theological and philosophical. I'm sorry. The most famous one, perhaps, is J.C. Bill's attempt to show that Jesus appears to be contradictory because he is a contradictory entity. So he defends what he calls a contradictory Christology. So what I'm going to present here okay, for some reason the projector turned off.
It's there.
I'm going to turn it off. Too blasphemy, right?
God is not happy about it.
Not at all.
Calling him contradictory. How dare you?
I'm not contradictory. Stop you.
It's the wrong kind of theism, dialectism. It's interesting that dialectism has theism in it. So why only dialectic fields? Just only
Yeah,
dialectic.
yeah, good point. I never thought about it.
I actually said that to,
So just dialectic.
to great priest.
Perhaps
Yeah.
the theism
Dialect-
we could go.
Dialectism. I said, then you must, you're a theist then. You believe
What is that?
dialectism. Just stop.
That's the title of the next paper. You can spell that atheism without
You know, I'm not as atheist as you are.
Oh, we have another perfect. Okay,
Oh, it's fine.
it's back. It's kind of odd.
Some playing.
It's a bit dark.
The other problem is species. Observable features. You should use.
You stop the clock, right?
Math.
No, I did.
And I did.
I'll give it 2 more minutes.
No, 5 more. It was a way it got found to be more time. It must be contradictory. Yeah, it's okay. Okay. Okay, sorry for this technical problem. Yeah, so what I'm going to do here is to present another application of this contradictory God thesis. I try to solve what I see as a theological problem in this tradition, the Vedanta tradition. And in order to do that, I'm going to use a version of Grand Priest's logic of paradox. It will be a simple application, as you'll see, but in my view, it has some philosophical and theological importance. All right, so I'm going to speak a bit about Vedanta, right? The tradition I will examine here belongs to this family of traditions, which is known as Vedanta. In its turn, it is a kind of Vedanta, of course. And we are all familiar with Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, and to a less extent to Madhva, Dvaita Vedanta. So while Shankara defends a radical non-difference between the ultimate reality called Brahma and the world and the individual selves, Madhva defends a radical difference between Brahma, the world, and the individual selves. So Vedanta theologians, they are somehow in between. Okay, they claim that the ultimate reality is both different, Veda, and non-different, abheda, from the world and individual selves. And behind this is an old Vedantic doctrine called Parinamavad that claims that the world is a real transformation of Brahma. Yeah, the critics are all messed up. And there are a lot of analogies here also. So there is this analogy that says that just as the essence of clay remains unchanged when transformed into a pot, the world retains the same essence as its ultimate cause, which is Brahma. So there is a kind of ontological oneness or non-difference between Brahma and the world, or as I prefer to call it, there's a kind of ontological continuity that extends from Brahma to the world and the individual selves. Sorry, yeah. So, but as far as the individual selves are concerned, they're also described as transformation of Brahma, but also as part of Brahma. This is stated in the Kama Sutra, for instance. Another analogy. So, just as fire and its light are fundamentally one, the light arises from the fire and shares its essence. Because individual selves are parts of Brahma, there is an ontological oneness between them and Brahma, or again, a kind of ontological continuity that extends from Brahma to the individual selves. All right, but my main concern here is with what I call the Veda claim, all right? Whether or not it is contradictory. So if you take non-difference as being equivalent to the negation of a difference claim, we get this one. Brahma is different from the world and the individual selves, and it is not the case that Brahma is different from the world and the individual selves, which is a form of contradiction. So we can ask, is this really a contradiction? So the standard answer is no. right? And in order to explain that, I refer to Vigena Bhikshu, a very famous theologian from the 16th century. And I will also refer to Andrew Nicholson's 2010 book. I quote, Vigena Bhikshu never attempts to uphold a statement in the form of D and not D. Instead, he understands difference and non-difference to be a case of D1 and not D2. D1 might stand for difference in one sense, such as mutual absence, while not D2, in not D2. D2 refers to difference or as separation. By mix the different definitions of difference and non-difference in such a ways, Vigena Bhikshu can avoid logical contradictions. So the strategy is very simple. In this part of the conjunction, we interpret the word difference in one way, and in the second part of the conjunction, we interpret the same word in a different way. So in this way, we don't get a contradiction. And the same strategy, you can say that is used by Nimbarka and Bhaskar, for instance. But there seems to be an exception, or a possible exception, which is exactly Jiva Goswami Chaitanya Vaishnava Vedanta school, which is known as Achintya Bheda Veda. So I turn to it now. So there are several distinguishing features, or the features that distinguish Jiva's tradition from other Vedanta traditions. The first one is that the ultimate reality, which Jiva connects with a verse from the Bhagavatam Purana, and he calls this ultimate reality Tattva. Anyway, this ultimate reality is described in terms of the kinds of Shakti that the ultimate reality possesses. So it is called Shaktiman, which means the possessor of Shakti. Depending on the way of how this ultimate reality manifests, it is called either Brahman, Paramatma, or Bhagavan. And the important thing for us here is that Bhagavan, which is like the full manifestation of this ultimate reality, is a person. One of its features is personhood. So we can say that Jiva's concept of ultimate reality is ultimately a concept of God. So second, the way the concept of Shakti is understood here. First of all, Shakti, God's Shakti, is said to be intrinsic to God's very nature. So again, we have a kind of ontological continuity between Shaktiman, God, that extends from Shaktiman to the Shakti. So another analogy, just as fire and its light are inseparable, with light naturally emanating from fire, God's several kinds of Shakti are equally inseparable from God. They ontologically depend on God, arising from God's own nature. And as Alan mentioned, there are different kinds of Shakti. So the tradition states that there are those three kinds of Shakti, the internal Shakti, the marginal Shakti, and the external Shakti. I'd like to pay attention here, which is also called Maya Shakti, which encompasses the material stuff that transforms into the world. So this is important because the Parinamavad defended by this tradition, it is really a kind of Shakti Parinamavad. It is this kind of Shakti that transforms itself into the world. So the ultimate reality, the world is a transformation of the ultimate reality, just in an indirect sense. All right, that's because it is called Shakti Parinamavad. There is just one more analogy, which is important to mention here, that expresses the difference between the three kinds of Shakti. So the sun gives rise to one, the radiance within its orb, to the rays that extend outward from him. Three, the sun's reflection on the surface of the water, for instance. So what's important here is that the Maya Shakti is compared to the reflection of the sun. So there is a kind of distance, even though all Shaktis, they have like God as its source, and they share God's nature. There's a distance between all those three kinds of Shakti. This is how they get rid of their problem of evil, but I want to about that. But so here we have my version of Jiva's Veda Veda claim. And the third difference is that the concept of achintya, inconceivability, plays a very important role in this tradition. So not only there is what I call the Veda Veda clan, now stated in terms of Shakti and Shaktiman, not anymore the world individual selves, and God, but Shakti and Shaktiman. So not only we have the claim that Shakti and Shaktiman are different and non-different from each other, we have also the claim that this very claim is achintya, inconceivable. All right, that's why the tradition is called achintya Vedanta. And also there's a very important relation between this achintya or inconceivability claim and what I called earlier the Veda claim, that Jiva states that because God's Shakti is achintya, inconceivable, the relationship of difference and non-difference between Shakti and Shaktiman is inconceivable. All right, but how should we interpret this? That's like my main point. So there are two interpretations. The first one is by far the most standard one, which claims that the interpretation understands the contradictory, the Veda claim as being contradictory. So it says that really Shakti and Shaktiman are different from each other, and it is not the case that Shakti and Shaktiman are different from each other, where these two propositions are the same. And this is inconceivable. And one of the reasons it is inconceivable is because it is contradictory. And many scholars, they defend these positions. It's really amazing. It seems to be like a standard position. And just to give you an idea, I will refer to Albie L. Kapoor's book. Even though it was written in the 60s, it is still a great book, quite comprehensive. And yeah, a great book. And so here he says, I quote, "The inconceivability of the relation is evident from the contradiction it involves. The achintya is that which is illogical, but we have to accept it on the basis of the holy texts. The concept of achintya is born out of respect for scriptural authority, which ignores the law of non-contradiction." So he relates like achintya and the contradiction, the law of non-contradiction, states very, very clearly that what I call here SC is really a contradiction. But there is a second interpretation, and the odd thing is that we find this second interpretation in those very authors that defend a contradictory interpretation. And I will refer here to the same author, Kapoor. So in another part of his text, he says as follows, I quote, just as there is neither absolute identity nor absolute difference between fire and its power, there is neither absolute identity nor absolute difference between Brahma and its Shakti. So basically, if we interpret absolute identity in terms of partial difference, we can do that very easily. We get this version of Jiva's Veda claim. Shakti and Shaktiman are partially different from each other, and it is not the case that Shakti and Shaktiman are absolutely different from each other. So here we have difference being interpreted in terms of partial difference, and here in terms of absolute difference. We don't have a contradiction anymore. This is the same strategy that Vijnana Bhikshu and Bhaskara and Nimbarka use, the same strategy. And Kapoor, he's not alone. Many other authors, they also use the same terminology. They speak about partial identity, absolute identity, absolute difference, absolute dualism, absolute non-dualism to characterize Jiva's tradition. And it seems that we have a problem here. In fact, we have 6 problems. I'm going to state them very quickly. So the first one is, of course, the two interpretations, they conflict with each other. Second, about the first interpretation, it conflicts with the analogies, because when you say that fire and it's like they are in one sense different and in one sense not different from each other, there's no contradiction involved, and we can understand quite clearly. It's not inconceivable at all. Third, Jiva seems to use something very close to the law of non-contradiction in his writings. So the first interpretation, which somehow challenges the law of non-contradiction, is at odds with that. Fourth, this is very important because this interpretation turns Jiva's theology into a contradictory theology. And we have a problem that because of the law of contradiction, Jiva's theology will be a priori false. And second, because of the principle of exclusion, anything will follow from Jiva's theology, then we want to be able to reason about it, or more specifically, about its concept of God. The fifth problem, now about the second interpretation, that Jiva's terminology in his writings, we just find difference and non-difference. There's no reference to absolute difference or absolute non-difference or absolute dualism or absolute non-dualism. And finally, the last one is still about the second interpretation. How are you going to make sense of the fact that this claim, which is not contradictory, is inconceivable? It is not inconceivable. On the other hand, it's quite conceivable, quite understandable. So this second interpretation, the non-contradictory interpretation, doesn't involve any inconceivable stuff. So that's the problem that I want to solve. And in order to do that, now we are going to go back to our favorite undergrad course, logic. So let's try to remember some stuff. So Priest proposed long ago a very simple, one of the simplest power-consistent logics, which he calls the logic of paradox. The idea is very simple. In classical logic, usually we have two true values, false and true, right? This is a three-valued logic. We have true, propositions might be true, propositions might be false, but there's a third true value, which he calls both, which means both true and false. Okay, so because of that, there might be a proposition alpha such that alpha and not alpha is both. It means both and true. Therefore, there might be two contradictions, bilateral. So it is consistent with bilateral. So I propose here a very slightly different version of Priest's logic, which I call a logic of partial truth. The difference is just one. Instead of this third value, I add another third value, partially true. So in this logic, propositions might be true, false, and partially true, which are represented with the help of the small tau. And when it comes to contradictions, oh, this is messed up. So the idea is that if alpha is partially true, I have here just a very simple sample of the truth tables. By the way, those truth tables are the same as Lukasiew's and Klein's three-value logic. Okay, no difference at all. And so looking at the truth tables, you can see that if alpha is partially true, then alpha and not alpha will also be partially true. So we don't have two contradictions, but we have, or we might have, partially true contradictions. And a very important thing is that while in classical logic we have just one designated true value, here we have two designated true values, true and partially true. What is a designated true value? It's basically the true value that should be preserved in inference rules. I'm going to give, as an example, the disjunctive syllogism rule, which says that alpha and if alpha and no alpha and no alpha, sorry, if alpha and beta and no alpha are true, then beta will also be true. Okay, this is a famous and very commonsensical inference rule. But it is not valid in this logic. Why? Because if alpha is partially true and beta is false, we have that alpha and alpha or beta is partially true, not beta, not alpha is partially true, but beta is false. So this inference rule is not valid in this logic because partial truth is not preserved. This is important because this is like how we get the principle of explosion from an inferential point of view. Okay, very quickly, if you have alpha and not alpha, and if you have, so by eliminating the conjunction, because of that, we have alpha, and we have also not alpha. From one, we get 2 and 3. And from 2, we get 3 through the disjunctive introduction. And from 4 and 3, using the disjunctive syllogism, we get beta. So that's how we get beta, any beta whatsoever, from alpha and no alpha. But because this rule is not valid, either in LPT or LP, we don't conclude beta, and therefore the principle of explosion is not valid in this logic. Okay, so a last point. Here we have a form of dialectics in this logic, but a weak form of dialectics, because a weak version of the law of no contradiction, sorry, a strongest version of the law of no contradiction is not valid. Okay, there can be a proposition alpha such that alpha and not alpha is either true or partially true, This is not valid in this logic. But a weaker form of the law of non-contradiction is still valid. There cannot be a proposition alpha such that alpha and no alpha is true. That is still valid in this logic. Okay, so it is not strongly dialectic, but it is in some form weakly dialectic, this logic. Okay, how I'm gonna apply this logic to this problem I just showed? It's very simple. So I will assume the first contradictory interpretation of Jiva, but I will assess that beta-beta claim, this beta-beta claim, within these three-value semantic framework. So basically, I will say that this proposition, Shakti and Shaktiman are different from each other, is partially true. Instead of being true, now I have this third value, which is weaker, of course. And I would say that this proposition is partially true. Consequently, this contradictory proposition will be only partially true. Okay, so I'm gonna have like a true contradiction, but which is only partially true. And so how this solves this problem? First of all, it incorporates also the second non-contradictory interpretation. Because it's like on the syntactic level, I have the first contradictory interpretation, but on the semantic level, because I use not true, but partial true, I take into account the second interpretation. It incorporates the analogies, because if when you compare fire and its light, yeah, we can say that it is partially true that fire and its light are different, and it's partially true that they are non-different, right? Three, it accepts the true version of the law of non-contradiction, the strongest, in fact, the weakest version, sorry. So in this way, when the law of non-contradiction is taught in terms of truth, this approach accepts the law. Okay, it is a paraconsistent and weak dialectic approach. So it solves those two problems. If I understand, like as I'm doing this beta-beta claim in terms of partial truth, the contradiction is only partially true, and because of that, it doesn't. It's not consistent with the principle of explosion, and I can't conclude anything from it. And the same thing. In the same thing, I can't cohere it because of that. The reason about Jiva's theology. Okay, the fifth problem. It is in accordance with Jiva's terminology, because the thesis is stated in terms of difference and non-difference. There's no like partial difference, absolute difference, and things like that from the syntactic level. And finally, this is tricky. The last problem is in the non-contradictory interpretation, how to make sense of the Achinta claim. I answered that by saying that this claim is also partially true. Okay, so the claim that SC is inconceivable, it is neither true nor false. It is also partially true. Okay, I'll skip the reason behind that. I can come back to it if necessary, but that's how I solve the sixth problem, and that's the last slide. So aside from, I hope, solving those six problems, I think this approach is really consistent with the idea that there is this ontological continuity between Brahma, the world, and individual selves, or between Shaktiman and Shakti. Because again, we state that the non-difference between them is only partially true, not true. So I will speak a bit in a moment about the concept of partial truth, which is very important. But anyway, from a kind of commonsensical view, if we say that they are partially, I mean, their non-different is partially true, this is consistent with the idea that there is this ontological continuity that extends from Shaktiman to Shakti. Okay, this is very important because when you speak about dialecticism and people, I mean, this is a very controversial thesis, right? But there are different kinds of dialecticism. And this is a very famous distinction by Edward Morris, where he makes the distinction between metaphysical dialecticism and semantic dialecticism. So basically, while metaphysical dialecticism is the view that there are things in the world that are actually inconsistent. So like Bill's thesis that Christ is a contradictory entity. Semantic dialecticism is the view that there are no inconsistencies in things. Inconsistencies, they arise or may arise just because of the relationship between language and the world. So I could explain more about that, but my approach is a kind of metaphysical dialecticism. Sorry, a kind of semantic dialecticism, not metaphysical dialecticism. Okay, so it's a quite weak and quite useful, depending on the context, form of dialecticism. And because of that, I spoke in the beginning about a strong version and a weak version of the contradictory God thesis. So because of that, as far as the contradictory God thesis is concerned, I'm here. I'm defending a weak form of the contradictory God thesis. It's just that this concept of God is philosophically tenable. I won't elaborate on the meaning of the expression. But I'm not here. I'm not defending that God is a contradictory entity. So I'm not, as far as contradiction is concerned, I'm not going, right? I'm not getting to this ontological level. Okay, drawbacks. First of all, there are some drawbacks related to the logical approach. I'm finishing. That's the last slide. For instance, in LP and in LPT, modus ponens is not valid, which is bizarre. But there are ways to solve that. I won't get into details. But the main thing perhaps is here, what partial truth means. And this is important because in philosophy of science, we have several accounts of notions like quasi-truth and Popper's truth likeness or verisimilitude. And even the very concept of partial truth is used by Da Costa, for instance. So I should give a more detailed account of what partial truth means. But as far as this approach is concerned, perhaps I don't need, because when logicians, they elaborate their semantics, they use the word true and false, but they don't bother about what truth means and falsity means. So then you get any theory of truth you want, and you're going to get details. So as far as a logical approach is concerned, I could leave it like that. But of course, I won't. One of the things that I want to do in the future is to philosophize on this concept. So that's it. These are the references I used. And thank you very much for your attention.